I found your hair on his coat once. Long, golden, a little too perfect to be mine. He said it must have been from the subway. I said nothing. Just like I said nothing when he started answering his phone in another room, or when he stopped saying, "I love you," without being prompted. You see, this isn't a letter from the woman he left behind. It's from the woman who watched herself vanish piece by piece while trying to be what he needed. I don't hate you. In fact, I hope you never learn to second-guess your worth the way I did, slowly, quietly, until you can't hear your own voice over his approval. He once told me I was too sensitive, and I believed it, until I realized I was just responding to the pain he caused. So no, this isn't jealousy. This is a warning, and perhaps the only truth he'll never tell you. Claire lives in a cottage that smells faintly of sea salt and lavender, tucked along the coast of a small Maine town where everyone still knows everyone's maiden name. Her house isn't large, but it holds the kind of quiet that you only earn after surviving noise. The wood floors creak in familiar protest, the windows fog on cold mornings, and a chipped teacup always rests on the porch rail like it's waiting for someone to come back. Most days, Claire teaches creative writing to high school students who think heartbreak is dramatic and temporary. She lets them think so. At 42, Claire moves through life like someone who remembers everything but doesn't often speak of it. Her neighbors say she's lovely, just a little private. What they don't see is the shoebox tucked beneath her bed, filled with letters she's written but never sent. Letters to him, letters to herself, and one, unfinished, addressed to the woman who sleeps beside him now. Claire doesn't hate her. She envies her innocence. The way she smiles in photos, unaware of the version of him that Claire met in the dark. The version that flinched at intimacy, that weaponized silence, that called her too intense after she cried when his mother forgot her birthday. The version that said, "Let's not label things," after 3 Christmases together. This town isn't where Claire grew up. She arrived 3 years ago, 1 suitcase and a heartbeat away from falling apart. But there's a calmness here. Salt on skin, sand in the kitchen tiles, a bakery that knows her name. No one asks questions. No one brings him up. She keeps a photo of a lighthouse on her fridge. It's not from a trip they took. It's from the day after he left. She drove for hours and stood at the edge of the water, not because she wanted to jump, but because she needed to see something that didn't move when love did. And on some nights, when the kettle sings and the wind presses against the glass like an old ache, she takes out a blank page and whispers, "The truth-only paper is patient enough to keep." The morning it all began, Claire wasn't searching for him. She had gone to the attic looking for a scarf, just something warm to wrap around her neck before walking to the bakery. The kind of errand that feels too quiet without the radio on. But instead, tucked between old winter coats and a forgotten shoebox labeled taxes, she found a small journal, leather-bound, the kind he used to carry, filled with illegible, scrawl and bold underlines. It wasn't his. It was hers. One she had started in the first year of their relationship, back when hope was louder than doubt. The pages were filled with memories she'd long stopped revisiting, moments she had convinced. Herself she'd outgrown. But time doesn't erase what it only buries. And there, folded neatly between 2 pages, was a printed screenshot of a social media post, a photograph someone must have tagged her in years ago, and she had carelessly tucked away. She stared at it for minutes. The caption read, "6 months today with this man. How did I get so lucky?" The woman was younger, cheeks flushed with happiness, leaning into the man beside her. Her hand rested lightly on his chest, her eyes full of trust. And there he was. Him. Wearing the scarf Claire had knitted one Christmas, smiling like someone who had never broken anything. She sat down on the floor, her back against a stack of boxes, the photo trembling in her hand, not out of jealousy, not even pain, but recognition of patterns, of how effortlessly he stepped into a new story while leaving the old one open-ended. No closure, no apology, just a quiet erasure. Claire didn't cry. Instead, she stood up, walked downstairs, and made tea the way she always did. Earl Grey, splash of milk, no sugar. She sat at her desk, opened her drawer, and pulled out the stationery she hadn't touched in months, the one with pale blue borders and gold-lined envelopes, the kind meant for things that mattered. She picked up a pen, one that still bore teeth marks from late-night grading sessions, and began to write, not to him, but to her, at first. But the words shifted, almost without permission, like ink choosing its own direction. And before she realized it, the salutation at the top of the page read, "To the girl he chose over me." She paused. Not because it felt wrong, but because it felt overdue. There was no bitterness in the room, only the sound of the wind outside, and the soft ticking of the clock above the bookshelf, steady, patient, like time itself was listening. Claire stared at the first line, then the next, and as her pen moved across the paper, something inside her unlocked. Not grief, not rage, but the need to reclaim the story no one had ever asked her to tell. And this time, she would tell it not as the victim, but as the woman who once loved deeply and learned painfully how to survive being replaced. She wrote for hours, the kind of writing that doesn't stop to think, doesn't pause to correct. Words poured out like breath after a long swim, desperate and pure. She wasn't writing to hurt anyone. She was writing to remember who she had been before she started dimming herself down to be easier to love. But memory is not linear. It doesn't arrive in order or on time. It sneaks in sideways. It was just one sentence that stopped her hand. Something simple. He never knew about the baby. And just like that, the air shifted. The pen dropped from her fingers. Claire sat still, staring at the words that had written themselves. Quiet, devastating. She hadn't planned to write that. She hadn't even thought about it in years, not really. That rainy October afternoon, the dull ache in her stomach, the clinic waiting room with peeling wallpaper and a woman beside her humming to herself. She had gone alone, told no one, not even him, because he had just been offered a promotion in San Francisco, because he was already distant, already sighing, too often, already forgetting small things like the groceries or how she took her coffee, because she thought telling him would make him stay, for the wrong reasons. And if he stayed, she knew he would one day resent her. So she kept it. All of it. She remembered folding the sonogram paper into the back of a book he never read. She remembered sitting at the kitchen table that same night, watching him laugh at a show she no longer found funny, and wondering how something so enormous could live inside her, while he stayed utterly unaware. Back then, she convinced herself it wasn't important, that the pain would pass, that it had been early, just a few weeks. But grief has no respect for numbers. It's not measured in trimesters or birth certificates. It just lives, quietly, somewhere in the body. She stood up now, walking to the bookshelf. There, between poetry collections and old travel guides, was the bell jar. She hadn't opened it since, and when she did, the folded paper was still there. Fragile, slightly yellowed at the edges. Proof that it happened. Proof that she hadn't imagined it. Even if she'd never said it out loud, she held it like it might disintegrate, and maybe, in a way, she hoped it would. Claire didn't cry. Not then. Instead, she sank to the floor, the paper still in her hand, and rested her head against the bookcase. Her breath was steady, but her heartbeat wasn't. It was the kind of grief that arrives in silence. No sobbing, no hysteria, just the aching clarity that you once carried a whole possibility inside you, and let it go without witness. She hadn't told anyone, Not Rose, not even Bee, who sometimes asked too many questions during their writing sessions. It had become a ghost she lived with, a quiet, constant presence. Some nights she would catch herself counting how old the child would be now. 7, maybe almost 8. A boy, she had always believed. With her eyes, but his restless hands, she wondered, as her fingers traced the curve of the sonogram's edge, what kind of father he would have been. If he'd noticed things like nightmares or scraped knees, or if he'd been just as distracted, holding his phone while promising to be there in a second. But that was all imaginary. What wasn't, however, was the way he made her feel smaller without ever raising his voice. The way he told her she was overreacting when she worried. The way he dismissed her tears with that practiced sigh. And the phrase she now hated more than any other. "You're being too sensitive." That sentence alone had unraveled her. It turned doubt into a shadow that clung to her every instinct. Over time, she began to question everything she felt, until one day she stopped trusting herself altogether. And now she was writing again. For the first time, not to explain herself, not to defend or justify, but simply to remember and record. She wasn't writing for him, or even for the girl he'd chosen. She was writing for the version of herself that once sat on a bathroom floor, hands shaking, whispering, "You'll be fine," because no one else would. The letter sat unfinished, ink smudged where her hand had trembled. But she knew one thing for certain. She would not edit that line out. He never knew about the baby. It wasn't a secret anymore. It was a truth, hers alone perhaps, but still worth saying. And just as she placed the sonogram back into the book, sealing it once again between two covers that had always felt too heavy, she whispered, "You don't need to be seen to be real." The next few days unfolded like a gentle unraveling. Not chaotic, not dramatic, just slow enough for everything to be felt. Claire didn't rush to return to the letter. She left it where it was, beneath the weight of a small ceramic paperweight shaped like a bird, something she'd picked up in a thrift shop during a weekend trip they once took together, back when they still held hands without thinking about it. Instead, she turned her attention to the corners of her life that had grown dusty. Quite literally. She opened windows that hadn't been touched in weeks, let the sea air pour in like a cleansing force. She washed the curtains, reorganized the pantry, and found herself humming songs she used to play while cooking for two. There was no need to force confrontation. The truth had already surfaced. Now she just needed time to live beside it, not underneath it. One morning, while walking past the harbor, Claire spotted Bee sitting outside the bakery, a notebook balanced on her knee, her brows furrowed in concentration. Claire almost walked past, but something in the curve of Bee's shoulders, so young, so eager to understand a world that hadn't yet broken her, made Claire pause. "You look like you're trying to solve a mystery," Claire said, stepping closer. Bee glanced up and grinned. "I am. I'm trying to write a character who's angry but doesn't know it yet." Claire smiled softly. "That's most of us, really." Bee patted the chair beside her. "Sit. Tell me something about your life that sounds like fiction." Claire hesitated, then sat. "I once bought a plane ticket to follow someone across the country. I packed a suitcase, printed the itinerary, and stood at the gate, and then turned around and went home." Bee blinked. "Did they ever know?" Claire shook her head. That was the point. Bee didn't press further. She just nodded like she understood in some profound, teenage way and scribbled something into her notebook. That night, Claire opened the letter again. She read it aloud this time, not dramatically, but quietly, like testing the weight of her own words in the air. The sentence still sat there, unflinching. He never knew about the baby. It no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a scar, closed, but still tender when pressed. And then came the memories. Not just of the pain, but of the strange beauty that had lived beside it. The way he used to leave notes in the fridge for her to find on bad days. "There's cake, and you're still my favorite person." The time he missed his sister's wedding because Claire had a flu so bad she couldn't lift her head. The night they sat on the roof of their old apartment and talked about naming stars after people who'd broken their hearts. They'd laughed then. She had really loved him, and he had, at some point, loved her too. The next day, she visited Rose at the bookstore. The bell chimed as she entered, and Rose looked up from her register, immediately. "Alert! You've got that look," Rose said. "Like someone who's been sorting through the past and found something too soft to throw out." Claire chuckled. "That's disturbingly accurate." Rose poured 2 cups of chamomile without asking. They sat near the back, in the corner surrounded by poetry books and dust motes dancing in the late morning light. "I wrote to her," Claire said after a long pause. Rose blinked. "To the new woman?" Claire nodded. "Not to send, but to say what was never said. For me, not for him." Rose tilted her head, her voice warm. "You've always had a gift for choosing grace over noise." Claire looked down at her cup. "I don't feel graceful. I feel exhausted." "That's the cost of loving deeply," Rose said. "But the interest you earn is your own return to self." Claire smiled at that. "You should put that on a bookmark." "Already did," Rose said, tapping the edge of her teacup with a wink. That evening, Claire walked along the shoreline behind her cottage. The tide had gone out, leaving behind smooth stones and tiny shells that looked like fragments of forgotten music. She knelt and picked one up, running her thumb over the ridges. She remembered something he once said, on a day when everything still felt possible. "You're like the ocean, too much sometimes, but I always come back." At the time, it had sounded like affection. Now she understood it differently. He had come back only when it suited him, only when the waters were calm. Claire slipped the shell into her coat pocket. She didn't need reminders of him, but some pieces felt more like reminders of herself. Who she had been, who she had protected, even when she didn't know how. She returned home, lit the candle again, and added 3 more lines to the letter. Not about him, about her. "You may love him, but I survived him. And that, perhaps, is the truer kind of love." And for the first time in years, Claire slept without dreaming of apologies that never came. The next few days passed like waves lapping at the shore. Steady, quiet, inevitable. Claire moved through them with a kind of reverence, as if tending to sacred ground. She returned to her routines with subtle changes. She no longer rushed her morning tea. She opened her windows wider. She listened to music without needing it to fill the silence. One afternoon, she visited the library where she used to volunteer before the heartbreak had made even that feel too loud. It smelled the same, like paper and old carpets and something sweet someone had probably hidden in their desk drawer. Mrs. Jenkins, the head librarian with her floral scarves and encyclopedic memory, lit up when she saw Claire. "Haven't seen you in a while?" she said, adjusting her glasses. "Still writing those beautiful little essays?" Claire smiled. "I'm trying again." She didn't say what kind of writing. Some truths still needed to stay tucked between pages. That same evening, as she sat in her reading chair with Figaro curled at her feet, she found herself returning to a box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were keepsakes, photos from trips. That felt like they belonged to another woman, ticket stubs from concerts they both pretended to enjoy, and a napkin with a phone number she never called. And then, at the bottom, a letter. Not one she had written, but one she had received. It was from his mother. Short, handwritten with kind words about Claire's steadiness and her calming nature, thanking her for making her son feel safe. Claire remembered that day well. She had driven 3 hours to surprise him at his parents' summer house. He wasn't expecting her. He hadn't seemed thrilled, but his mother, She'd welcomed Claire like a daughter. Claire folded the letter slowly. Even now, it felt heavy. A reminder that even people who love us can forget us in the end. That night, Claire returned to her desk. The letter, to the girl he chose over me, was longer now, deeper. No longer just a warning. No longer a story about him. It had become a letter to herself, a record of every time she stayed when she should have left. Every time she shrank to fit a space that was never meant for her. Every time she made excuses for why his silences were acceptable. And suddenly, mid-sentence, she paused, not because she had run out of words, but because she had finally said the one thing she had never dared write. I don't miss him. I miss who I thought I was when he loved me. The truth hit with such softness it hurt. That was the ache she had been carrying all these years. Not the absence of him, but the absence of the imagined version of herself who was chosen, adored, and never doubted. She closed her eyes, leaned back, and let the stillness bloom around her. Some letters are never meant to be sent. Only written, only survived. Take a moment here. Maybe close your eyes. Maybe breathe a little slower. When you're ready, we'll keep going. Claire woke early the next day and took the long way to the market, passing by the cafe where she and him used to sit by the window, sharing croissants and crossword puzzles. The table was empty now. A new waitress worked there. The cushions had changed. The air had not. She didn't stop. She just looked and kept walking. On her way back, she ran into Rose, who was kneeling by a stack of new books outside the shop. "Have you decided what to do with the letter?" Rose asked, her tone casual, like they were talking about dinner plans. Claire hesitated, then nodded. "I think I'll keep it. Not send it, just let it exist." Rose smiled. Some things are meant to live quietly. That night, Claire did something she hadn't done since the beginning. She sat by her window, opened the letter one last time, and added a final line. "You will never know the version of me who cried on that bathroom floor. But I do. And she deserved better." She folded the letter slowly, placed it into the gold-lined envelope, sealed it with her thumb pressed flat. She didn't burn it, didn't shred it. Instead, she walked out to the shore with Figaro trailing behind, her boots pressing into the soft sand, the tide whispering near her ankles. She carried a small glass jar in her hand, and inside it, carefully rolled, tied with twine, was the letter. She stood for a while, letting the wind tangle her hair, then waded knee-deep into the water and let the jar go. It floated for a moment, like it might return, then drifted further, out, away. It was the evening after she let the jar go, when the tide had taken it, and with it, a weight that had lived inside her ribcage for years, that the real shift began. Claire didn't expect anything miraculous to happen. There was no thunderclap of closure, no shooting star slicing across the sky in triumph. Just the slow, unfamiliar stillness of something ending, and not needing to be explained. She spent the evening in silence, not the kind that gnawed, but the kind that soothed. The kettle hissed softly on the stove. Figaro slept beside her, warm and oblivious. Outside, the wind pushed against the window panes like a quiet reminder that time always moves forward. She reached for the mirror that hung above the mantel. It was old, spotted in the corners, slightly warped from years of sea air. But it was honest. She stared for a long time. Not out of vanity, but curiosity. When was the last time she looked at herself, really looked, without checking for mascara, smudges, or wondering if her neck was starting to give her age away? She couldn't remember. The woman looking back at her wasn't broken. She wasn't bitter. She didn't wear grief like an accessory anymore. She looked aware. And that, Claire realized, was new. She walked to her desk, not to write, but to sort. One by one, she opened drawers and folders, pulling out every fragment she had once kept like evidence. His notes, their photos, little receipts from date nights that felt significant at the time. She didn't rip them, didn't toss them away. In cinematic flares of release, she simply gathered, placed them in a box, closed it, labeled it not with his name, but with her own, because this wasn't about forgetting him. It was about reclaiming the pieces of herself that had been lost in the middle of their story. The next morning, she called B. "I want to take you somewhere," she said. B, curious as ever, agreed. They met at the cafe, then drove 2 towns, over, to a small coastal museum Claire had always loved, but hadn't visited in years. The kind of place filled with shipwreck artifacts, handwritten logs from long-dead sailors, and glass cases housing the ordinary objects people once thought worth keeping. Claire led B to a display tucked in the back, a faded photograph of a woman holding a letter on a beach, her dress whipping in the wind. "She was never identified," Claire said. "No one knows who took the photo, or why she was there. But she's remembered now. Because someone kept the moment." B stared at it. "She looks like she's saying goodbye." Claire smiled. Maybe she was saying hello to herself. They didn't stay long, but on the drive back, B was uncharacteristically quiet, and Claire didn't fill the silence. She just let it stretch, warm and undemanding between them. When they reached Claire's house, B turned to her before stepping out. "You don't talk about him like someone who broke you," she said. Claire paused. "Because he didn't." B blinked. "But didn't he leave?" Claire nodded. "Yes, but only after I left myself." B frowned, confused. Claire continued, voice steady. "I stopped asking for what I needed, stopped speaking when I was hurt. I made myself easier, to love by becoming less. And when he walked away, he didn't take anything I hadn't already surrendered." B didn't respond right away. Then, softly, "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." Claire smiled. "No, darling. That's the beginning of something better." That night, Claire went back to the shore. The tide was low again, the rocks slick and glowing under the moonlight. She walked without thinking, feet familiar with the path, until she reached the place where the sea curved like a whispered promise. She stood there, arms wrapped around herself. Not to protect, but to feel. Everything. Every inch of the woman. She had become through leaving, through staying too long, through writing letters and letting them go. She remembered the last fight they had. Not the words, they'd blurred, but the silence afterward. The way he had gone to sleep like nothing had happened, and she had lain there wide-eyed, wondering how 2 people could share a bed and still be so impossibly far apart. And then, the smaller moment, the one that stayed. They were in the kitchen. He had just told her that he didn't want to define the relationship, that things were good as they were. She had nodded, smiled, said, "Sure, I understand." But inside, she had heard a scream, not anger, just pain. The sound of her own heart folding itself into something smaller. She had ignored it, and that was the real betrayal. Not his, but hers. The moment she chose silence over self. Now, standing on this beach years later, Claire whispered aloud the things she hadn't let herself say that day. I wanted more. I deserved more, and the wind didn't disagree. She walked home barefoot, let the sand stay between her toes, let her hair tangle, let it all remain, messy, human, real. Before bed, she wrote one final page. Not a letter, not a confession, just a note to herself. You are not too much, you never were. You were just asking the wrong person to meet you there. And that truth, quiet and unremarkable on the page, was the most powerful one she'd ever written. The next morning, the sun arrived gently, gold light spilling through gauzy curtains, brushing the hardwood floor like a kind hand. Claire rose, early, made tea, and left it to steep longer than usual. She moved slowly, deliberately, as though her bones understood something she hadn't yet put into words. She wandered into the living room and noticed the empty spot above the mantel where the mirror had hung the night before. She'd taken it down after that long stare, hadn't realized it until now. It sat leaning against the wall beside the bookshelf, and when she lifted it, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection again. This time, there was a new softness, to her eyes, but a firmness too. She didn't look lost anymore. She didn't look like someone waiting to be loved back. That afternoon, she wrote a short piece for her students, titled, "Things I Didn't Say When I Should Have." It wasn't personal, not obviously, but each line carried the shape of her. I'm not fine. I wanted to be chosen. I don't like being the one who understands more. You hurt me. I pretended it was okay. I left parts of myself behind just to keep the version of you I hoped was real. She printed it out, folded it, slipped it into her bag. She would read it to them, not because they needed to know everything about her, but because she wanted them to grow up knowing that truth wasn't something to be ashamed of. And then, almost out of instinct, she opened her phone. She hadn't looked at his profile in months, maybe years. But that day, something told her she could do it without crumbling. He looked the same. Maybe a little older, thinner somehow, in a way not quite physical. There were photos of him and Amelia, now with a baby, a boy. Claire studied the child's face longer than she meant to, not because she felt jealous, but because she didn't. There was no sting. No hollowing, just stillness. A quiet farewell whispered not to him, but to the echo of him inside her. And then, something surprising. She smiled. Not bitterly, not wistfully, but with the kind of smile that came from knowing she would be just fine. She put her phone down, picked up her coat, and walked out into the day like it belonged to her, because it did. The house was quieter than usual that Sunday, not in the way it had been before, dull and heavy, but in a more dangerous way, the kind of quiet that creeps in once the adrenaline of letting go has passed, when no one is coming back, when no one needs you to be strong anymore, when you no longer have a reason not to feel at all. Claire sat by the kitchen window, watching the steam rise from her cup of coffee, untouched. The wind outside stirred the hydrangeas in the garden, petals falling like soft confessions. It was a beautiful morning, the kind that might once have inspired her to bake a tart or call a friend. But today, it only made the emptiness more visible. She hadn't cried since the letter. Not when she sent it into the ocean, not when she packed the memories away, not even when she admitted to Bea that she had betrayed herself long before he did. But grief is not linear. It's a delayed storm. And that morning, it arrived. It came, not as sobbing or screaming, but as a slow ache in the chest, a dull, physical pressure. Her throat tightened, her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes burned, not with the sharp sting of tears, but with the weight of what had been unsaid for far too long. Because the truth was, it wasn't just him she lost. It was the child she never held. It was the time she gave away so freely, without asking for anything back. It was the version of herself that believed she was hard to love, and so tried to earn it. Day after day, by being softer, quieter, smaller. She had lived through years of absence disguised as companionship, through holidays spent watching couples laugh across tables while she smiled through the loneliness she never dared name. Through birthdays with gifts that showed he didn't really know her, scented candles she was allergic to, books from authors she never read. She had called it compromise. But it had always been resignation, and worst of all, she had stayed. Not because she didn't see the cracks, but because she was afraid of what life would look like without even those broken pieces. The tears came slowly. Not violent, just steady. Like they had waited for permission. She didn't try to stop them. She cried for the baby, for the woman she once was, for the things she never asked for the silences she filled with apologies, for every time she made herself small so someone else could feel big. She cried until the coffee had gone cold, until the light shifted in the window, until her cheeks felt raw and her body, somehow, lighter. And when the crying stopped, what remained was not relief. It was a stillness, a clarity, that she could have had a different life. Not necessarily a happier one, but one where she didn't abandon herself so many times in the name of love. That was the true loss. It wasn't him. It was her own voice, buried beneath the weight of needing to be chosen. She rose from the table and walked into the bedroom, the sun now slanting across the sheets. Everything looked ordinary, but she felt like she had survived something extraordinary, something no one else would ever see. A private unraveling, a quiet reckoning. She opened the drawer of her bedside table and found the small box she had, labeled with her name. She opened it, held the sonogram again, this time not as a relic, but as a reminder of what she had carried, of what she had let go, of what she had been strong enough to face, even alone. She placed the sonogram gently back into the box, closed it, then did something she hadn't done in years. She opened the window beside her bed and let the air in. The sound of wind chimes from a neighbor's porch floated in. Somewhere, a child laughed, a dog barked. The world, unchanged, continued on. But inside her? Something had shifted, not healed, not yet, but opened. That night, sleep came late. Claire lay in bed with the window cracked open, letting in the ocean air, cool and damp, curling around the edges of her blanket like a memory still clinging to the frame of her life. The moonlight poured into the room, casting pale silver across the walls, soft enough to feel like breath, distant enough to remind her she was alone. She wasn't afraid of solitude, not anymore. But there was a difference between solitude and aftermath. She stared at the ceiling, her fingers laced over her stomach. Her heart beat softly, but her thoughts were loud. She found herself remembering small things, fragments that hadn't mattered at the time, but now came back with startling clarity. The night he forgot her birthday, not just the gift, but the day altogether. The moment he corrected her pronunciation in front of his friends, the way he sighed when she brought up the future, the way he didn't look for her in a crowd, not once. She had explained all of it away. He's tired. He doesn't like birthdays. He's not good with words. And the worst lie of all, but he loves me in his way. She had bent so far to make room for his way that she had lost sight of her own. She had shrunk inside the walls of their relationship like a plant grown too long in a pot, too small. And when he left, it wasn't because she was too much. It was because she was no longer enough for the idea he had built of himself. That realization didn't come like a knife. It came like rain, soft, relentless, cleansing. Claire sat up, pushed off the blanket, and walked barefoot to the hallway. The old wooden floor groaned under her steps, as if the house itself remembered. She paused by the door to the second bedroom, the one they had once called the maybe room, the one with the empty bookshelves and the rocking chair they bought at a garage sale, just in case. She hadn't opened that door in 2 years. Tonight she did. The air smelled like old paint and pine. The rocking chair was still there, draped with a yellowed throw. A lone curtain moved in the breeze. There was nothing in the room but space and silence, and the idea of a life that had never begun. Claire stepped in and stood for a long moment. She didn't cry this time. Instead, she whispered, "I'm sorry." Not for the choices, but for the time she took to forgive herself. Then gently, almost ceremoniously, she walked to the window, opened it wider, and stood there as the wind passed through her hair, lifting it like a memory being released. Behind her, the rocking chair creaked once, and in that sound, she heard not ghosts, but grace. 3 days after she opened the maybe room, Claire received a message. It was tucked among promotions and unread newsletters, something she might have deleted without a glance if the sender's name hadn't caught her eye. Amelia S. For a long second, she just stared at it. Her hands froze mid-air, hovering above the keyboard. The subject line was vague. This might be strange. And still, she didn't open it. Not yet. She made tea first, swept the kitchen floor, fed Figaro. She folded a towel that didn't need folding and replayed imaginary versions of what might be inside. A thank you? An apology? A confrontation? Or worse, a kindness Claire hadn't asked for. When she finally clicked it open, her breath already shallow, she wasn't prepared for how ordinary it was. Hi, Claire, I know this might feel inappropriate, and if it is, I understand if you never reply. I found your email through some old shared Dropbox folder. I wasn't snooping, just sorting files, and your name came up. I hope you're doing well. I wanted to reach out because I recently found something I think might have been meant for you, a letter. Handwritten. Folded into an old book of his. The Bell Jar. I was looking for something to read on a train ride and pulled it from a box he'd left in the attic. Inside was this note, addressed to C. No date, just a few lines. I asked him about it. He said it was nothing, that you two had ended peacefully. But I read it. And Claire, it wasn't nothing. I'm not sending it to be cruel. I just thought you deserved to know he did try to say something, even if it never reached you. If you want me to mail it, I will. Take care. Amelia. Claire read it twice, then a third time. Her hands didn't tremble, but something inside her did. A letter? Hidden in the bell jar. The very same book where she had hidden the sonogram. It felt almost laughably cruel, like the universe was reminding her how close they had been to hearing each other, yet how perfectly misaligned they'd remained. She replied simply, yes, please send it. Then, instead of sitting still, she walked, through town, past the bakery, past the library, to the edge of the rocky coastline, where fog was beginning to gather like a memory that hadn't yet decided whether to stay or lift. She didn't cry, but she whispered, he wrote it, and I never saw it. And somehow, the wind didn't sting as much as it used to. The letter arrived 4 days later, folded into a pale blue envelope, its edges soft from time. There was no return address, just her name written in handwriting. She hadn't seen in years, but still recognized instantly. She held it for a long while before opening it. Not because she was afraid of what it might say, but because a part of her already knew. The living room was quiet. Outside, the rain had begun to fall. Soft, rhythmic, almost thoughtful. She sat by the window, the envelope in her lap, and finally, with careful fingers, slid the letter free. It was short, fewer than 100 words. Claire, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know what I want it to do. Maybe it's cowardly to write this now, when everything is already too quiet between us. But I need you to know. There were so many moments I should have said something and didn't. I saw the look in your eyes when I disappointed you. I knew when I pulled away, when I blamed your feelings for things I didn't want to face. You were never too much. I was simply not enough to hold the kind of love you offered me. That wasn't your fault. It was mine. I'm sorry. She didn't cry. There were no gasps, no sharp intake of breath, just a silence so full it almost hummed. The words didn't change what happened. They didn't rewind the years or resurrect the child she never held. or undo the quiet departures that had carved her into someone else. But they did something she hadn't expected. They gave her back her memory. Because for so long, Claire had questioned her instincts, wondered if she had imagined the distance, the withdrawal, the shifting shadows in their home. She had carried that doubt like a stone in her chest, even after the grief had passed. Now, finally, she had proof. Not of his love, but of his awareness. He had seen what he did. He just hadn't said it when it mattered, and yet, somehow, that was enough. Not for closure, but for peace. Claire refolded the letter slowly and slipped it into the same box where the sonogram now lived. This time, not as a relic of pain, but as a record of truth. A moment of recognition, long delayed, but no less real. She lit a small candle beside the box, then whispered, with no audience but the wind and the memory of a man who once almost loved her well. I forgive you. But more than that, I forgive myself for waiting so long to hear it. It was a Tuesday in late spring when Claire bought the paint. The color was called Early Fog, a soft gray with a whisper of lavender. She smiled when she saw it, not because it reminded her of anything, but because it didn't. For the first time in years, she wasn't choosing based on memory. She was choosing what felt calm in her hands now. She carried it home, humming faintly, unaware. The kind of hum that only happens when your chest is no longer knotted tight around the past. Over the next week, she painted the spare room. The maybe room. The room that had once held silent expectations. A chair that rocked without anyone to cradle, and walls that seemed to hold their breath. She opened the windows, played music, let light fall across the empty floor. She didn't turn it into anything new. Not a guest room, not a nursery, not a home office. She just let it be a room for herself. One afternoon, Rose came by with a basket of peaches and a jar of honey. I saw you buying paint, she said, grinning. That's usually the start of something. Claire nodded, wiping her hands on a rag. It's not a metaphor this time. I just wanted a different color. Rose placed the basket on the table, then leaned in closer, her voice soft but sure. You've changed, Claire tilted her head. Better or worse? Wider, Rose said, like someone who finally fits back into her own skin. Claire didn't respond. She didn't need to. That weekend, Bea graduated. Claire stood in the back of the auditorium, clapping as her name was called. Bea spotted her in the crowd and waved, subtle, like a secret they'd never spoken aloud. Later, they sat on the beach with sandwiches and sand between their toes. Do you ever think you'll write him back? Bea asked gently. Claire shook. Her head. He never sent it, and I don't owe anything to silence. Bea picked up a pebble, studied it. Do you miss him? I miss who I thought I could be, with him, Claire said. But not him. Bea nodded. That's a better kind of missing. They watched the tide roll in. A dog barked somewhere behind them. Children shrieked joyfully at the coldness of the water. Claire closed her eyes and tilted her face to the wind. She still had the letter, and the sonogram, and the journal filled with words she would never publish, but none of it weighed her down anymore. They were simply pages in a book that no longer needed a sad ending. One morning in June, Claire returned to the post office, not for a package, but to mail something, not to him. Not to Amelia, to herself. She had written a letter the night before on a sheet of her best paper, using the fountain pen she once kept for grading. It read, Dear Claire, you made it through. Not with dignity every time. Not without cracks or questions. But you're still here. And more importantly, you are still soft. You didn't let grief turn you brittle. You didn't let love unspoken become love undone. You didn't let the child you lost take away the woman you are. You are not waiting anymore. You are living, and that is more than enough. Love me. She sealed it, addressed it to her own name, and dropped it into the red box outside the old general store. When it arrived 3 days later, she opened it slowly and cried, not because she was sad, but because the girl who had waited so long to be seen had finally received something worth holding. That evening, she made dinner for one, pasta, wine, jazz humming in the background, and as the sun slipped behind the curve of the earth, she stepped outside barefoot, letter in one hand, tea in the other. She watched the stars appear, one by one, and in the quiet, Claire didn't wonder if anyone was thinking of her. She thought of herself, and for the first time, that was enough. If you've ever written a letter you never sent, if you've ever forgiven yourself in silence, if you've ever chosen yourself quietly, this story was for you. Leave a comment. Share your letter, or simply whisper it into the wind, and maybe, like Claire, you'll finally hear it echo back. The next day, Claire received a postcard. It was from a place she had never been. Santa Fe, maybe? The handwriting was unfamiliar, slanted and elegant. No signature, just 3 short sentences. Saw this and thought of you. The sky here looks like a second chance. Hope you're letting the light back in. She flipped it over and stared at the picture. It was a desert sunrise, the kind of color that didn't belong to anything. Rose gold clouds pulled across the horizon like brushstrokes on courage. There was no return address. No clue as to who had sent it, but somehow that didn't matter. She pinned the card to her fridge, right next to the photo of the lighthouse she had taken years ago, the one she once thought symbolized standing alone. Now, it just looked like strength. In the weeks that followed, Claire began to notice small things. The way her shoulders no longer curled inward while walking. The way she started conversations in cafes instead of just waiting quietly for her coffee. The way she stopped bracing herself before checking old messages. She even joined a book club. They met every other Thursday in the back room of a plant shop, where succulents lined the windows and someone always brought lemon bars that crumbled at the edges. Claire didn't speak much the first time, but when someone mentioned reading the bell jar, she smiled and gently said, "Sometimes you can hold pain without letting it take over the whole story." No one questioned it. They just nodded. The group read poetry next, and Claire brought a few of her own pieces, anonymous at first. But when one of the members, a retired teacher named Ruth, turned to her and said, "Whoever wrote this knows what it means to survive a silence." Claire met her gaze and replied, "Yes, I think she does." Outside the bookshop that evening, she stood for a while beneath the strings of fairy lights. The air smelled like lavender and old pages. People passed. Music drifted from somewhere. She felt present, not haunted, not searching, just here. And then, for the first time in a long time, someone caught her eye. He was older, kind eyes, worn denim jacket, a paperback under his arm. He didn't smile like a man trying to impress. He smiled like someone who understood timing, understood distance, understood that some people come late not because they were lost, but because they finally turned around. He nodded. Claire nodded back. She didn't speak, didn't force a moment. But as she walked past him, something flickered inside her. Not hope. Not yet. But possibility. That night, she wrote in her journal, just one line. Maybe the best stories don't need to be rewritten. Just continued, from the part we stopped reading aloud. Before bed, she turned off every light but one. She poured herself a glass of water, sat in the silence, felt her feet on the floor, her breath in her chest, her name in her mouth. She whispered it softly. Not because she was trying to remember it, but because it finally felt like hers again. Claire. Just Claire. Not someone's almost. Not someone's replacement. Not someone's lesson. Just a woman who once wrote a letter she never sent and ended up hearing herself at last.